What if the first mistake of humankind was not believing something false, but believing too soon? In the quietest hours of the night, when familiar things lose their sharp edges and even the most trusted shapes turn briefly unfamiliar, the history of mankind begins to feel less like a sturdy building and more like a ruin half hidden under drifting fog. Some walls are still standing. Few names remain readable. Bones have been recovered, measured, dated, and placed under the careful light of museums. And yet between everything that has been found, an odd emptiness lingers, as though time had not only swallowed objects, but connections, transitions, perhaps entire chambers of remembrance. Before the body sinks completely into this stillness, a very small moment may be saved to like this video and subscribe to the channel. But only if something here truly makes one wish to stay. Anyone who feels moved may share the place and the hour at which they are listening. There is a quiet comfort in the thought that somewhere in the darkness, small points of light are awake at the same time, drifting into the same slow current of the night. While the story of where humankind came from begins to unfold, that story is most often told as a straight line. It begins in dust and stone, feels its way through swamps and icy valleys, rises through tools, fire, painted caves, burials, languages, cities, a sequence, a progression, a readable movement from the simple toward the complex. There is something soothing in this. Lines comfort. Lines take from chaos its power. Lines give the human a sense of not being here by accident, but of having emerged from a comprehensible depth. Yet the longer one's gaze rests on the edges of this line, the stranger it begins to behave. Where everything should look clear, gaps appear. Not the small uncertainties that accompany every honest science, but real silences. Wide zones in which traces are missing. Transitions that seem too smooth. Sudden leaps that read as though something had been left out. Tools surface, vanish, change. Groups of humans meet, intersect, vanish again. Genes whisper of neighborhoods that older stories did not foresee. Coastlines where people may have lived for tens of thousands of years now lie beneath the sea. Sanctuaries appear whose symbolic weight feels older than the order into which scholars later tried to fit them. Not everything fits the story that has so often been passed down with such calm confidence. Perhaps this is no surprise. Every origin tale is necessarily incomplete because beginnings are never tidy. Origin does not happen in a single moment. It is not stamped with a clean inscription. It leaves no neat first page. Humans do not step out of a doorway as soon as the world is ready to write down their names. They emerge through branchings, climatic moods, migrations, seasons of hunger, accidents of inheritance, catastrophes, and encounters with other kinds of humans who were never merely footnotes or rough drafts. Already this thought makes the familiar simplicity porous. Yet it is perhaps not enough to explain the deeper feeling that lies over this story, because it is not only disorder, it feels more like loss, as though the past of mankind had not merely left little behind, but had once possessed more, and that more had slipped away, as though certain knots of memory had been severed, a flooded plain, a burned archive, a faith that displaced an older one, a hand that decided which knowledge would remain sacred and which would crumble into dust. Not every gap points to intent, but some gaps do not feel natural. They feel smoothed. The unease, then, begins not with a wild claim, but with a quiet observation. Mankind knows its earlier steps only in fragments. It possesses bones, layers, tools, pigments, graves, genetic traces, sky myths, broken stones, sunken coasts, and legends that resemble one another across continents, like echoes carrying far further than the voice that first released them. Many clues, but clues are not yet a homecoming. the more that is found, the harder it sometimes becomes for the picture to settle into anything final. Once a simpler order was enough. The modern human stood at the end of a long march, surrounded by more primitive figures who'd fallen behind. The world was a classroom. Development was a rising staircase. But that staircase has cracked. Other forms of humans were not merely shadows at the margin. They lived. They thought. They buried their dead, survived their winters, made their tools, and left their inheritance silently in the blood of later generations. The origin of the human begins to behave less like a single trunk and more like a forest whose roots reach deeply into one another. And beneath the awe this provokes lies a question that resists being fully spoken aloud. What if the problem is not only that prehistory was more complicated than imagined, but that part of it has gone under for good, not as a metaphor, but in the literal sense? Beneath seas, beneath sediments, beneath the rubble of later worlds. The last ice age did not end gently. Whole landscapes vanished. Coasts where generations may have lived were swallowed in slow, irreversible steps. If camps, sanctuaries, or early communities once stood there, then with them perhaps certain chapters of human origin sank into a darkness that no sunlight will reach again. The question turns strangely silent. It is no longer only a matter of fossils and dates. It becomes a question of memory itself. How much of a species remains intact when its earlier stages drown? How much of its first convictions survive when later orders no longer understand the older signs? How much truth can a portrait of history bear when, out of necessity, it must be smoothed into something teachable, ordering, comforting? Perhaps the deeper abyss lies in this: that the human always seeks his beginning at the very moment he invents it. Each age tells itself an origin that flatters its self-image. Religious eras searched for a sacred dawn. Empires sought noble ancestors. Modern systems sought measurable development. Beneath all these forms rests an older, darker possibility: that origin is never fully available, that the first story of mankind was never cleanly preserved, but guessed at from fragments, that the beginning was perhaps not lost because no one wished to keep it, but because the world itself moved repeatedly across its earliest traces, until even the shape of what had once been there became unreadable. And if that is so, then the fog grows thicker, not thinner. Somewhere within that fog a single soft question begins to take form, not yet ready to be answered and not yet ready to be asked. Every fog has a centre, and the centre of this one lies precisely where confidence used to be strongest. Once the gaps along the edge of the human story are noticed, the eye is drawn back toward the trunk itself, toward those familiar markers that school books and museums have arranged into a single rising road. Tools become better, brains grow larger, behaviour becomes more complex, symbols emerge. Eventually the modern human steps onto the stage as the natural endpoint of a slow, dignified ascent. It is a beautiful arrangement. It is also, in many places, beginning to disobey itself. There are dates that arrive too early. There are tools that appear in regions where, according to the accepted choreography, no such hand should yet have been working. There are caves whose painted walls reveal a maturity of imagination that the older models reserved for much later epochs. There are seashells pierced for stringing into ornaments long before the supposed dawn of symbolic thought. There are pigments crushed and stored in workshops whose level of organisation sits awkwardly within its assigned period. None of these findings, taken alone, would shake the structure, yet taken together they create a curious vibration. The line is not so much wrong as restless. It moves under one's gaze, refusing to lie still where it was placed. For a long time, this restlessness was treated as noise around the signal, a misdated sample, a contaminated layer, an overly enthusiastic interpretation. Each anomaly was carefully filed away, often with reason, sometimes with haste. But once one steps back from any single case, a quieter pattern emerges. The anomalies do not gather randomly. They cluster around transitions, those very moments where the official narrative most needs clarity, around the first appearance of art, around the first complex burial, around the first long-distance trade in shells, obsidian, ochre, around the first seafaring. It is as though the fabric of prehistory has been worn thinnest precisely at the seams. This raises a strange and difficult possibility. What if the timeline is not merely incomplete in its details, but distorted in its proportions? What if certain capacities, the symbolic mind, the planning hand, the cooperating group, emerged earlier in more places than the accepted picture allows? Not as a single global awakening, not as a hidden super-civilization rising and falling unseen, but as scattered local intensifications, regional flourishings whose continuations were broken by climate, migration, or simple bad fortune. Such a vision would not require fantasy. It would require only the admission that human depth is not a privilege of late antiquity, but something already pulsing in the long, mostly invisible darkness before the agreed-upon beginning. The cracks deepen further when the question of behavior is examined. Bones can be measured, skulls can be modelled, but the inside of a head leaves no fossil. Whether a being 300,000 years old felt grief, sang, dreamed, or imagined the future cannot be read directly from the curve of a brow. Inferences must be drawn from indirect signs. A flower placed in a grave, a red handprint on a wall, a bead carried far from its source, a bone flute pierced with deliberate intervals. Each of these signs is small, each is contestable, and yet each whispers that the inner life of early humans may not have followed the staircase as obediently as once supposed. Awareness, it seems, did not wait for civilization. It may have wandered the earth long before there were cities to greet it. There is also the strange matter of pacing. The accepted story tells of long, almost geological slowness, millennia in which little appears to change, followed by sudden bursts of innovation. The bursts are often described as revolutions: the cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, the urban revolution. Yet the metaphor itself betrays unease. Revolution is what one calls an event whose preparation cannot be fully traced. It is the historian's word for surprise. When too many revolutions are needed to keep a timeline intact, the timeline begins to look less like a record and more like a scaffold built around silence. Perhaps the slowness was not always so slow. Perhaps the bursts were not always so abrupt. Perhaps what has been read as discontinuity is in part the shadow of evidence that did not survive. Further unease arises around the question of who counts as fully human. The category itself, once treated as self-evident, has grown porous. Anatomically modern bones now appear far earlier than the textbooks of even a few generations ago would have allowed. In Africa, fragments older than 300,000 years already show features uncomfortably close to those of the present. In Asia, scattered finds suggest complex populations whose place in the family tree remains unsettled. The smooth replacement model, one wave of moderns sweeping across the world and erasing all others, has retreated. In its place stands a far messier picture, in which several kinds of humans coexisted, sometimes for tens of thousands of years, sharing landscapes, perhaps tools, perhaps fires, perhaps something stranger and more intimate than either group ever suspected. If the boundary between us and them is no longer a wall but a long, unsteady horizon, then origin itself loses its preferred shape. There is no single dawn to point to. There are dawns. There are mornings that began and were interrupted. There are mornings that flowed into one another so gradually that no one inside them could have told the difference. The human emerges not from a sealed chamber but from a chorus of overlapping voices, some of which fell silent, some of which mingled, some of which still hum quietly inside the bodies of their distant heirs. To call this an ascent is to flatter what was, in truth, a wandering. What unsettles most is not that the picture is incomplete. Every honest science is incomplete. What unsettles is the suspicion that the very form of the picture, the line, the staircase, the triumphant arrival, has shaped which evidence was sought, which was emphasized, which was quietly set aside. A frame does not only hold an image, it selects it. And once a frame has been hanging on the wall long enough, it begins to feel like the wall itself. Removing it is unsettling, not because what lies behind it is necessarily different, but because the act of removal exposes how much of what seemed solid was in the end only an arrangement. Perhaps the line was never truly a line. Perhaps it was a path through fog, drawn after the fact by people who needed to walk somewhere and could not bear to admit how often they had lost their way. The fog itself does not vanish when the path is questioned. If anything, it grows more present. But within that fog, faint figures begin to take shape. Figures who do not fit the procession the line was meant to lead. Some of them resemble us closely, some of them do not. Some of them may have stood beside our ancestors at the same fire, exchanging glances across a difference no longer fully nameable. And the question of who they were and what they carried with them when they vanished becomes one of the heaviest weights that any honest account of human origin will ever have to lift. Among those faint figures glimpsed through the fog, some have begun to acquire names. Not the names they once gave themselves. Those are gone beyond any possible recovery, but names assigned later in laboratories and conferences, often based on the valley or the cave where their remains first surfaced. Neanderthal, Denisovan, Floresiensis, Naledi. Each name marks a moment when a single bone, a single tooth, a single sliver of preserved DNA forced the family of the human to grow wider than it had been allowed to be the day before. And each name, once spoken often enough, begins to dissolve the comfortable boundary between us and them, until it is no longer entirely clear where the boundary ever truly stood. The Neanderthal has had the strangest fate of all. For more than a century, the popular imagination dressed him in a costume of failure, heavy-browed, slow-witted, a brutish footnote whose only purpose was to make the modern human look luminous by contrast. School illustrations gave him a stooped posture he never possessed. Cartoons gave him a grunt for a voice. The very word entered everyday speech as a synonym for crudeness. Yet the cave of Shanidar yielded a body buried with what appeared to be flowers. The cliffs of Brunissel revealed a chamber, deep underground, where someone had broken stalagmites and arranged them into careful circles long before any modern human is supposed to have set foot in Europe. Pigments were ground, shells were pierced, wounds were tended in individuals who survived years past injuries that should have killed them, suggesting that someone, somewhere, decided they were worth keeping alive. None of this turns the Neanderthal into a mirror image of the present. It only suggests that the mirror was always more crowded than was admitted. Then came the Denisovans, and with them an unfamiliar kind of ghost. They did not arrive through a complete skeleton, or even a partial one. They arrived through a single fragment of finger bone, a few teeth and a jaw, and through something stranger still, their genetic signature, lingering in the bodies of people alive today. Populations in parts of Asia, in the islands of the Pacific, in the high cold of the Tibetan plateau, carry within them traces of an ancestor whose face has never been clearly seen. The high-altitude tolerance of Tibetan herders, allowing them to breathe at elevations that exhaust most others, may itself be a gift inherited from this almost faceless people. They are remembered not in monuments, not even in skulls, but in the quiet chemistry of lungs and blood. A vanished kind of human still working invisibly inside the living. The implications begin to cascade. If the Denisovans were absorbed into us, if the Neanderthals contributed segments of code that shape immune systems, skin tones, and perhaps even patterns of sleep in present-day populations, then the modern human is not a pure stream that flowed past lesser tributaries on its way to the sea. It is itself a confluence, a meeting place, a continuation of encounters whose details have been forgotten by every party involved. To say one descends from a single line is in this light a kind of polite simplification. The truth is messier and considerably more humbling. Each body is a quiet record of negotiations whose terms no one remembers signing. This realization touches more than biology. It touches the question of what was lost when these other humans went silent. A genome can be partly reconstructed, an anatomy can be partly inferred. But a way of seeing the world cannot be retrieved from a tooth. Whatever the Neanderthals understood of fire, of seasons, of grief, of stars wheeling above Pyrenean nights, vanished with the last individual who carried that understanding. Whatever rituals the Denisovans performed in the high caves of Central Asia disappeared without a single witness leaving a written word. Entire vocabularies of meaning have evaporated, leaving behind only the bare suggestion that they once existed. The fossil record holds bodies, it does not hold minds. The minds, if they were there at all, drifted off with the breath that animated them. Even more unsettling is the suspicion that the parting between these populations and our own may not always have been gentle. Some encounters surely were peaceful, even intimate. Others may have been violent, indifferent, or simply slow attritions across centuries of competition for the same valleys, the same herds, the same caves. The eventual quiet of the Neanderthal world coincides with the spreading presence of anatomically modern humans across Europe. And although the older idea of a sudden replacement has been softened, the shadow remains. Whatever happened, it was not a simple peaceful merger. Something ended. Something else continued. And in the silence that followed, the survivors slowly forgot the others had ever been distinct. Then there is Homo floresiensis, the small-statured human of Flores, whose existence on a remote Indonesian island as recently as 50,000 years ago was, when first announced, treated by some scholars as nearly impossible. A miniature human fashioning tools, hunting dwarf elephants, surviving alongside other types of humans on the same Earth. The picture seemed too strange to be permitted. Yet the bones did not retract. They sit now in their cabinets, modest and patient, witnesses to a branching of the human story that no preceding model had foreseen. And on the South African plateau, in the deep chambers of the Rising Star Cave, the bones of Homo naledi appear to have been deliberately placed in difficult-to-reach passages, in arrangements that hint at intention, perhaps even ritual. The brain of this species was small. The behaviour implied is not. The mismatch refuses to resolve into anything tidy. The accumulated weight of these discoveries presses against an old reflex. The reflex assumes that the modern human is the only true bearer of meaning, the only kind capable of inwardness, the only one whose presence on the earth deserves seriousness. But the evidence has been quietly suggesting otherwise for some time. There were others. They thought. They mourned. They imagined. They left behind no songs that can be heard, no words that can be read, but they left enough small signs to insist that they were here. To insist also that the modern human is not a solitary climax, but a survivor among kin who did not survive. The crown placed so confidently on his head has been resting all along on the bones of cousins. It is difficult to dwell long on this thought without feeling a small displacement at one's centre. The story of where humankind comes from has been told for so long as a story of arrival that the question of who failed to arrive is rarely asked. Yet the mind, once the question is opened, returns to it. Out of the many forms of human that the earth produced, only one remained. Why that one? Why not another? Whether the choice belonged to chance, to climate, or to something darker the survivor would prefer not to examine too closely. And whether, in the slow blurring of millennia, the surviving line carried within it the secret weight of all the others, hidden in genes and dreams it can no longer trace to their source. The kin who did not survive left their bones where the earth could keep them, in caves, in dry plateaus, in valleys whose climate proved kind to calcium and slow to rot. But not all bones rest where they fell. Many came to lie in places the earth itself would later abandon. Plains became seabeds, estuaries became deeps. The shore where a child once gathered shells in the early morning is now, in many parts of the world, hundreds of meters below the surface, blanketed in sediment that no archaeologist has yet learned how to read in full. To speak of human origins without speaking of the drowned coasts is to mistake the visible part of the picture for the whole. At the height of the last glaciation, perhaps 20,000 years ago, the seas of the world stood far lower than they do now. Vast quantities of water were locked into the great northern ice sheets, and the continents wore wider skirts of land than the present map suggests. The English Channel did not exist. Britain was joined to the European mainland by a low, marshy plain that researchers have come to call Doggerland, where forests grew, rivers wandered, and herds of red deer and aurochs left their tracks in the soft ground. Trawlers in the North Sea still drag up the occasional bone, the occasional flint, the occasional fragment of a barbed antler harpoon, small, mute reminders that this floor was once a country. Between Australia and New Guinea stretched another wide land, often called Sahul, while a sprawling shelf called Sunda connected what are now the islands of Indonesia. The Persian Gulf, today a shallow inland sea, was once a fertile valley, watered by the same Tigris and Euphrates that feed Mesopotamia, though their courses ran much further out. Around the world, perhaps 10 million square kilometres of habitable land, an area larger than today's Europe, lay above water at the moment when the climate began to turn. When the ice began to melt, it did not melt evenly. There were long, slow centuries of retreat, punctuated by sudden surges, when collapsing ice dams or unstable margins released enormous volumes of meltwater in geologically brief intervals. Some of these surges were almost certainly visible within a single human lifetime. A coastline that had stood for as long as anyone remembered would begin to creep inland, swallowing a familiar reed bed one decade, a sacred grove the next, a known fishing camp the one after that. Children would grow up hearing of beaches their grandparents had walked, beaches now several days' walk seaward of the new shore. Eventually, in some regions, the surges would have outpaced even oral memory, leaving only the shape of a story behind, a place that used to be, a path that no longer leads anywhere, a name attached to nothing one could still see. It is on these vanished plains and shores that some of the most consequential chapters of the human story may have unfolded. Coastlines are not marginal places. They are richer than the inland in food, in mobility, in opportunity. Tidal flats yield shellfish at almost every low water. Estuaries concentrate fish. Migrating birds break their journeys at the same lagoons year after year. A people settled on such an edge can subsist with less effort than those scrabbling against the dry interior, and with less effort comes a room for other things, for ornament, for ritual, for the long apprenticeships out of which symbolic culture grows. If there were ever places where humans first developed dense networks of trade, complex calendars of return, Cosmologies bound to the rhythm of tides, it would be reasonable to suspect that the coast were among them, and those coasts are now almost everywhere beneath salt water. The implications are not quite mystical, though they brush against something close. Ordinary archaeology, by the simple fact of having to work where digging is possible, has spent most of its energy on inland sites. Caves in limestone hills, open-air encampments on terraces above modern rivers, burial mounds on dry plateaus. These places have given up their treasures with patience, and from them the prevailing picture of the deep human past has been built. But this picture is, by necessity, the picture of those who did not live by the sea, or rather, of those whose living traces survived because they happened not to be near the older sea. The peoples who once camped along the lost coastlines, whose middens grew over generations into entire artificial hills of shell, whose hearths were arranged on what is now the continental shelf, are mostly absent from the record. Not because they did not exist, but because the record does not reach into the dark water where their fires went out. A few exceptions only sharpen the unease. Off the coast of Israel, the submerged village of Atlit-Yam preserves stone houses, wells, and even sacrificed cattle in a layer of seabed sediment, a glimpse of Neolithic life now 7 or 8 meters under the Mediterranean. Off the coast of southern India, scattered structures lie in the Bay of Cambay at depths that have led to fierce arguments about their age and even their nature. In the Black Sea, layers of sediment record an event that some researchers have argued was a sudden inundation, when rising Mediterranean waters breached a former freshwater lake, a flooding that may have driven entire communities outward across Europe and Asia, carrying their stories with them. Each of these cases is debated. None alone proves a global pattern, but each is a reminder that the sea has been, for our species, not only a horizon but an archive, and an archive that takes more than it returns. What was carried into the archive cannot be retrieved as a list. It is not only camps and middens, it is whatever ways of seeing arose in the long apprenticeship of life along a moving edge. This relationship between sky and water, learned by people who watched both for survival. The reading of birds, of currents, of the colours of reef shelves, the names given to features of a coast over centuries, names that made the place a known being rather than a mere terrain. All of that knowledge was perishable in the most ordinary sense. It lived only in the bodies of those who carried it. And when those bodies were forced inland, or did not survive the upheaval, the knowledge dispersed along with them, untranslated. What was retained may have been a small weathered fragment of what had once been there. The rest is silence under sediment. It is tempting when contemplating this to think only in terms of loss, but there may also be something stranger to consider. If the deep memory of humankind first ripened along shores that are no longer accessible, then the inland record from which the modern picture has been assembled is not merely incomplete, it is biased in a quiet, almost invisible way. The dry highlands tell one kind of story, the lost coast told perhaps another. The two need not have been the same, and if a part of what made our species what it is took shape on those vanished edges, then the absence of their evidence is not just a missing chapter, it is a missing voice, one that may have been speaking to the rest of the species for a very long time, before the rising water silenced it forever. The voice from the lost coast cannot be recovered, but every so often, on land that the rising sea did not claim, the ground gives up something that does not match the version of human history school children are taught to recite. A few miles north of the Syrian border, in the dry undulating plateau of southeastern Anatolia, a low hill called Göbekli Tepe rises gently above the surrounding fields. For centuries local farmers had ploughed around it, occasionally striking carved stone with their tools, occasionally cursing the obstacles, occasionally noting that the place had a strange feel about it. Surveys in the 1960s mentioned the site briefly and dismissed it as a medieval cemetery, the carved fragments thought to be broken grave markers. The hill was left alone again. It kept its secret beneath the wheat for another generation. When excavation finally began in the 1990s, what emerged from the soil refused to fit anywhere in the established sequence of human development. Massive T-shaped pillars of limestone, some 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, stood arranged in deliberate circles. Their flat faces had been carved with reliefs of foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, wild boars, lions and creatures harder to name. Animals shown in postures of motion, of threat, of ritual significance. Pairs of taller pillars stood at the centre of each enclosure, their forms abstracted but unmistakably anthropomorphic, with arms folded across their lower fronts and belts carved at their waists, as if representing beings only partially human, looming inward over those who once gathered at their feet. The geometric arrangement of the circles, the consistent orientation of the central pillars, the symbolic weight of the carvings, all of it spoke of intention, of long planning, of an idea about the world that had already been worked out before the first stone was set in place. What undid the comfortable timeline was the dating. The lowest, oldest layers at Göbekli Tepe yielded dates in the 11th and 10th millennia before the present. This placed the site in its earliest form more than 6,000 years before the supposedly first cities of Mesopotamia. It was older than Stonehenge by some 7,000 years. It was older than writing, older than the wheel, older than pottery in that region, older than any clear evidence for villages large enough to support such a project. According to the model that had governed thinking for most of the 20th century, monumental religious architecture was something that arose late in the human journey, after agriculture had produced surpluses, after surpluses had produced specialists, after specialists had produced priests, and after priests had organized the labor of farmers into the building of temples. Gobekli Tepe stood that sequence on its head. The temple, or whatever it was, came first. The fields came afterward. The discoverer of the site before his early death suggested that the people who built these enclosures had not yet fully crossed into farming. They appear to have been hunter-gatherers, or at least people in the long transitional period when wild cereals were being intensively gathered but not yet cultivated. They came from communities scattered across the surrounding hills, perhaps drawn together by ties of kinship, by ceremonial obligation, by the demands of a shared cosmology that required a common point on the landscape. They quarried stone in nearby outcrops, shaped it with simple flint tools, dragged the great pillars across miles of uneven ground, raised them in carefully prepared sockets, and decorated them with images of the wild creatures that filled their world. Then, generation after generation, they refilled the older enclosures with rubble and built new ones above or beside them, in a slow rhythm of consecration and burial that lasted more than 1,000 years before the entire complex was deliberately covered with earth and abandoned. The ordinary tools of explanation falter here. To call it a temple imports later assumptions. To call it a sanctuary risks the same. To call it merely a meeting place understates the labour and the symbolism. What can be said is that an enormous expenditure of effort was directed over many human lifetimes towards an end that was not survival, not shelter, not defence. It was directed towards something invisible. Whatever cosmology stood behind those carved boars and snarling foxes, it was strong enough to mobilize cooperation across communities for centuries. It was strong enough to make stone speak. And the people who spoke through stone were not the placid early farmers of the textbooks, easing slowly out of the wild. They were still, in a meaningful sense, of the wild. The wildness is even etched into the pillars themselves. Predatory animals far outnumber the prey, as if the spiritual landscape was filled with beings to be feared, beings to be honoured, beings whose attention had to be courted carefully. This reverses an old assumption. For a long time, the standard story held that religion arose to give meaning to the lives of settled communities, that gods were the late ornaments of agricultural existence, that monumental sacred architecture required the prior existence of cities and kings. The hill in Anatolia hints at the reverse possibility. It hints that gathering for shared meaning may have come first, and that the difficulties of feeding crowds returning year after year to a sacred place may have helped push human beings toward the more intensive management of plants and animals that would eventually become farming. The temple may have built the village, rather than the village building the temple. If true, this would mean that the deepest source of civilization was not economic but symbolic. Not the granary but the gathering. Not the surplus but the song. There is also the matter of what such a feat implies about earlier capacity. Göbekli Tepe did not arise in a vacuum. The technical command, the artistic confidence, the social coordination required to plan and execute these enclosures must have rested on traditions older still. Stoneworking at this level is not a beginner's craft. The carving styles show both individual hands and shared conventions. The arrangement of the pillars suggests an inherited geometry, the kind of disciplined design language that takes generations of refinement to acquire. Whoever raised these stones was not improvising the human capacity for monumental sacred work. They were inheriting it, and inheritance, by definition, has parents. Where those parents stood, what they built that did not survive in stone, what songs they sang, and what rites they performed without leaving so much as a postmole behind, none of that is presently visible. What is visible only suggests that the visible cannot be all of it. Other sites in the same broader region, Karan Tepe nearby, with its strange pillared chamber and watching faces, Navali Kori, partly drowned now by a modern reservoir, Kayonu, with its terrazzo floors stained by ancient blood, quietly reinforce the suspicion that what surfaced at Gobekli Tepe is not a freak isolated marvel, but the visible peak of a half-submerged tradition. A tradition, that is, whose deeper roots have not yet been reached, and whose full shape is still hidden somewhere beneath the patient soil. There is no comfort to be found in pretending that this changes nothing. It changes the order of operations. It pushes the spiritual seriousness of the human past further back than was thought permissible, and it leaves, on the dusty hilltop above the wheat, an unanswered question carved silently into stone, waiting for whoever is willing to admit that the story might begin earlier than they were taught. The question carved into the limestone of that Anatolian hill does not stand alone. Many hundreds of kilometers to the south, in the deep rift of the Jordan Valley, another mound rises out of the dry plain, layered with the residues of human presence so thick and so old that excavators must dig downward through entire epochs to reach the bottom. The mound is called Tel es Sultan, but the name carried by the place in human memory is older and far more famous, Jericho, the town that, by the most cautious dating, has been inhabited or revisited for some 10,000 years, perhaps longer. A town that, like Göbekli Tepe, refuses to behave the way the textbook would have it behave. Long before walled cities are supposed to have appeared, Jericho already had a wall. Around the 9th millennium before the present, while most of the world's people are still imagined as small, mobile bands chasing game across savannas and tundras, the inhabitants of this oasis at the foot of the Judean cliffs were quarrying stone, dressing it and stacking it into a defensive perimeter several meters high, encircling an area of perhaps 4 hectares. Inside the wall, against its inner face, they raise something stranger still, a round tower of solid masonry more than 8 meters tall, with an internal staircase of carefully cut steps spiraling up through its core. The tower is older than the pyramids by nearly 5,000 years. It is older than the earliest known writing by at least 3. It is older than every cherished marker of the so-called rise of civilization in the conventional account, and yet it stood unmistakable in a community that did not yet know pottery, did not yet keep domesticated cattle, did not yet write, did not by the most careful inferences even fully cultivate cereals in the systematic sense the later Neolithic would refine. The puzzle of the Jericho Tower has not been resolved in the century since its excavation. For a long time, the wall and the tower were assumed to be defensive, evidence of a young town protecting itself against raiders or rival groups. But the more closely the structure has been studied, the less convincing this purely military reading has become. The tower stands on the inside of the wall, not a position that would help defenders shoot outward. Recent analyses have suggested another, stranger possibility. On certain days of the year, the surrounding hills throw their shadow precisely across the settlement, and at the summer solstice the shadow of the largest nearby peak appears to fall on the tower at sunset, as if the structure were keyed to a moment of cosmic alignment. If this reading is correct, the oldest known stone tower in human history was not primarily a fortification at all. It was an instrument, a device for marking time, for marking the relationship between earth and sky, perhaps for binding the community to a calendar of ritual. The walls themselves may have been built less to keep enemies out than to enclose a sacred geography. The town, in this reading, was a temple as much as a settlement, and the line between the two was not yet drawn. Beneath the floors of Jericho's later houses, the dead were placed in the ground in ways that deepen the strangeness. Skulls were sometimes removed from the body after the soft tissues had decayed, plastered over with a layer of fine clay shaped into the features of a face, and inset with shells in the eye sockets. The result is uncanny. Neither portrait nor mask, but something closer to a held memory, a face preserved long after its owner had vanished, kept perhaps in a household shrine, perhaps cradled at certain ceremonies, perhaps spoken to. Other skulls were grouped together in caches, multiple ancestors brought face to face beneath the floor of a living dwelling. The presence of these plastered skulls across several Neolithic communities of the Levant, at Jericho, at Ain Ghazal, at Tel Aswad and elsewhere, implies a shared ritual world of considerable depth, in which the dead remained members of the community in some functional sense, and in which the boundary between living and ancestral was permeable in ways the modern mind has trouble entering. Set beside Göbekli Tepe, the mound at Jericho extends rather than contradicts the unsettling pattern. Long before the moment when civilization is supposed to have emerged, communities in the same broad region were already organizing themselves around things that do not appear in basic survival manuals. They were building monuments oriented to the sky. They were enclosing landscapes for reasons that exceed defense. They were preserving the heads of their dead and treating them as ongoing presences. Whatever was happening in the human interior in those millennia, it was not the simple bare bones of subsistence. It was a complicated, layered, symbolically demanding existence, a life in which what one believed about ancestors, animals, the sun and the dead shaped the very stones one chose to lift. Other early sites in the wider Near East deepen the impression. At Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, a few millennia later, the tightly packed houses of a large settlement were entered through holes in their roofs, the floors above the dead, the walls painted with bulls and leopards and dancing figures. There were no streets. There were no temples in any obvious separate sense. Sacred and domestic space melted into one another. At Asıklı Höyük, slightly older, similar patterns appear, The dwellings layered upon their predecessors so that each new floor was laid almost directly on the bones of those who'd lived before, the entire mound becoming in time a stratified body of memory. To live in such a place was to walk daily upon one's grandparents, to sleep beneath roofs that had been raised over the heads of generations of one's own line. The continuity between past and present was inscribed not only in story but in plaster, in earth, in the intimate geometry of the room itself. It is worth pausing here to register what these arrangements imply. The deep human past as visible at sites like Jericho was not a stage in which technical skill outran inner life. The opposite seems closer to the truth. Inner life was already vast, already capable of treating a tower as a clock against the heavens, a skull as a kept companion, a house as a layered tomb. The technical achievements that survive are the visible residue of an immense interior already at work, and the order of explanation that placed inwardness at the late end of human development, that imagined an ascent from mute survival through tool-making to symbol, with religion arriving only after the bread was secure, does not match what the diggers keep finding when they dig deep enough. If both Gobekli Tepe and Jericho are read together, a pattern begins to surface that is hard to set aside. In two different landscapes, separated by hundreds of kilometers, communities living before the conventional thresholds of civilization were already engaged in monumental, symbolic, calendrical, and funerary practices of remarkable complexity. The standard account would explain such practices as relatively late developments, fruits of agricultural surplus and political organization. But the chronology disagrees. The chronology insists that something else was already there, something the bare timeline does not name, and the longer that something remains unnamed, the more it begins to look as though the entire scaffolding of how the human came to be himself may have been built in the wrong order, with the cause and the consequence quietly reversed by writers whose interest, perhaps, lay in placing themselves at the summit of a story that, in truth, may have begun rising long before they thought to climb it. The story climbed for a long time before anyone began to write it down. Yet when writing finally appeared, it carried within itself something that did not feel like a beginning at all. It felt, in places, like a remembering. Among the very oldest texts that survive, clay tablets pressed in cuneiform along the rivers of Mesopotamia, hymns inscribed on temple walls along the Nile, palm leaf chants preserved in the long oral memory of the Indian subcontinent, one motif returns with a persistence that has long unsettled those who notice it. A great water came. The world that had been was washed away. A few survived, carrying with them the fragments of a knowledge that had once been whole. The Sumerian poem of Atrahasis, written down by perhaps the 3rd millennium before the present but built upon traditions older than its tablets, tells of gods who decided to destroy humanity with a flood, and of a wise man warned in advance, who built a vessel and saved his household and the seed of the living. The Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh contains a closely related episode, in which Utnapishtim recounts how the deluge came, how the boat rose on the waters, how the dove was sent forth, how the mountains finally broke the surface again, how the gods themselves regretted what they had done. The Hebrew scriptures preserve a version of the same story under the figure of Noah. The Greek tradition speaks of Deucalion, the only man permitted to survive when Zeus drowned the bronze race. In India, the laws of Manu describe a primordial sage saved from a world flood by a horned fish. In China, the long labour of Yu the Great is still remembered as the bringing of order back to a land overwhelmed by water. Across the Pacific, in the high mountains of South America, in the forests of Central Africa, in the storytelling of indigenous peoples of North America and Australia, related accounts surface again and again, not always identical, never fully reducible to one another, yet recognizably members of the same disquieting family. A reasonable mind has every right to hesitate before such a pattern. Floods, after all, are common. Rivers overflow. Coasts are smashed by storms. Local catastrophes leave local memories, and human imagination is fond of certain shapes. The surviving few, the saving vessel, the vanished old order. To ascribe every flood myth to a single global event would be to flatten an immense diversity of cultures into a single explanation they did not ask for. And yet, the dismissive opposite, the assumption that all such stories are merely poetic, flourishes with no historical kernel, does its own kind of violence. It assumes that the only events worth remembering are those ones that left clean physical traces, and that any memory which exceeds the available evidence must be invention. This is a generous assumption to make about modern record keeping. It is a stranger assumption to make about traditions that lived for thousands of years entirely in the mouths of those who had no other archive than themselves. There are now reasons to suspect that some of these traditions may indeed encode the warped reflection of real events. The end of the last glaciation was not a quiet warming. It included episodes of extraordinary upheaval. Around 14,000 years ago, and again about 12,000 years ago, sea levels rose in pulses that, in some regions, may have advanced inland by tens or even hundreds of meters within a few generations. There is geological evidence for sudden discharges of meltwater from the dying ice sheets of North America and northern Eurasia, releasing volumes of cold, fresh water large enough to alter ocean circulation across entire hemispheres. There are signs, in cores drilled from the bottom of the Black Sea, of an event in which Mediterranean waters, swelling with the global rise, eventually breached a natural barrier and poured into what had been a freshwater basin, drowning its shores in a relatively brief span of time and forcing the people who lived there to flee outward in every direction. There is the long, careful work of geomythologists and paleoclimatologists who have begun to read certain catastrophe stories not as pure fancy, but as compressed reports of phenomena their tellers had no other vocabulary to describe. In this light, the global persistence of flood traditions begins to look less like coincidence and more like residue. Not residue of a single deluge that drowned the entire planet at once. The geological record does not support such a single event, but residue of many regional inundations, scattered across many millennia and many landscapes, all sharing one essential fact. They happened to people whose lives, until the moment of disaster, had assumed that their familiar coast, their familiar valley, their familiar lake, would always be there. That betrayal of the ordinary, repeated again and again across the long thaw, may have shaped a human style of remembering that gravitated, almost helplessly, toward the same essential shape. The world ended. The sea took it. The few who escaped did so by virtue of warning, of skill, of providence. They carried something forward. What they carried forward is the most haunting part of the pattern. In nearly every version of these stories, the survivors are not blank vessels who must rebuild from scratch. They bring something with them. In some traditions, they bring seeds, animals, the rudiments of agriculture and building. In others, they bring laws, instructions, the memory of how a city was once arranged, or how the heavens were once read. In still others, they bring the knowledge of writing itself, of metals, of medicine, of music, of the calendar, and they bring it from before. Mesopotamian texts speak of antediluvian sages, the Apkallu, half fish, half human beings, said to have brought all the arts of civilization to humankind in a time before the flood, after which only fragments remained. Egyptian priests, according to Greek travellers, spoke of teachings preserved in temple records that reached back into a vague immensity of years before the present order, an immensity later writers transcribed as figures so large they ceased to mean anything specific. The figure of the saved sage, the boat-borne keeper of pre-deluge knowledge, recurs with a persistence that itself demands explanation. It is not necessary to believe in lost golden empires to feel the weight of what these stories may be quietly preserving. It is enough to grant that human beings have lived through real disasters, that those disasters have sometimes been catastrophic enough to shatter local social orders, and that what survives such shattering is rarely a complete civilization. What survives is fragments, practical fragments, ritual fragments, fragments of know-how, carried by those who escaped, often misunderstood by those who received them later. A few generations after the event, the precise circumstances are gone. What remains is the impression. There was a before, and it was different, and it was lost. Out of that impression, slowly in the warm light of campfires far from the drowned coast, the flood story takes its inevitable shape. Whether one then trusts these stories to bear any literal cargo at all becomes a matter of temperament more than method. The cautious will say they preserve nothing but the universal grammar of grief. The bolder will say they preserve, in distorted form, the memory of specific upheavals at specific places, glimpsed now only through the prism of song. What can hardly be denied is that something in the human past is being rehearsed in these tales, again and again, by peoples who in many cases never met, and the something being rehearsed does not ask anyone's permission to be remembered. It simply keeps surfacing in language after language, as if it were a fact too heavy to ever fully sink. A fact too heavy to sink will, sooner or later, attract the attention of those who try to read the bottom of the world. For a long time, the bottom of the world was thought to be a stable thing, a foundation upon which more interesting events took place. Climate was a backdrop. Geology was a backdrop. The drama of human history played out against scenery that, on the relevant timescales, did not move. That assumption began to crack quietly through the 20th century, and in recent decades it has cracked more loudly. Among the moments where the cracking is most audible is one strange interval near the end of the last ice age, an interval that geologists half poetically came to call the Younger Dryas. Around 12,900 years before the present, the world had been warming for some time. The great northern ice sheets were retreating. Forests were beginning to push back into ground that had spent millennia under glacier and tundra. Coastlines were rising. Animals and people were spreading into landscapes only recently freed from ice. And then, with a suddenness that troubles every attempt at slow narration, the climate flipped. Within decades, in some records within years, temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere plunged back toward glacial conditions. The forests that had begun to grow in northern Europe died back. Tundra returned to regions that had only just lost it. The named flower of that returning cold, an Arctic alpine plant called Dryas, gives its name to the entire interval. For roughly 1,200 years, the world that had begun to thaw was held in a renewed grip of cold. Then, equally abruptly, the cold released. Within a human lifetime or two, the warming resumed, and the world set off toward the climate of the present. Two abrupt transitions in only a few generations each. A long, anomalous chill in between. A sequence which, even seen from the calm distance of an ice core, has the quality of a reversal in mid-sentence. The causes of this Younger Dryas event are still debated. The mainstream explanation has long pointed to the rerouting of glacial meltwater. As the ice retreated, vast lakes of meltwater accumulated along the southern margins of the dying ice sheets, and at certain moments these lakes broke their ice dams and poured suddenly into the surrounding seas. One such release into the North Atlantic is thought to have disturbed the ocean currents that carry tropical heat northward, weakening them enough to plunge the lands around them back into cold. This explanation has good evidence behind it. It also leaves room for further questions, because in recent years a more dramatic alternative has been quietly gathering material to support it. In sediment layers across multiple continents dated tightly to the onset of the Younger Dryas, researchers have reported finding unusual concentrations of microspherules, tiny droplets of melted rock, alongside elevated levels of platinum, iridium, and traces of nanodiamonds, all of which together resemble signatures left by extraterrestrial impacts. A so-called black matte layer of dark, carbon-rich sediment marks this horizon at many North American sites, often capping the last evidence of certain large mammals and of the distinctive Clovis culture that had been hunting them. From this material, a hypothesis has emerged that around 12,800 years ago a fragmenting comet or asteroid encountered the Earth's atmosphere. Scattered fragments and airburst explosions across a wide region set immense fires in the forests of North America, destabilized the ice sheets further, and helped to trigger the climatic flip that followed. This Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is contested. Many specialists remain skeptical. Some of the proposed evidence has been challenged on technical grounds. The matter is unresolved, and honesty requires that this be said plainly, but the hypothesis has not been refuted to general satisfaction either, and it has continued to accumulate adherents who find that the convergence of signatures cannot easily be explained away. Whatever its precise cause, the Younger Dryas itself was real. Its effects on the human world cannot have been minor. People who'd been adjusting, generation by generation, to a warmer and gentler Earth were suddenly forced back into colder, harsher conditions. Migration patterns of game changed abruptly. Vegetation zones shifted. River systems, swollen and then frozen and then swollen again, behaved unpredictably. Coastal lands continued their slow drowning even as the air grew colder. Across the planet, the great megafauna of the Pleistocene, the mammoths, the mastodons, the giant ground sloths, the cave lions, the short-faced bears, the woolly rhinoceroses, were thinning toward extinction in a process whose precise causes still divide researchers, but in which both climate volatility and human pressure played some role. To the people alive then, none of this would have looked like a debate among scholars. It would have looked like a world losing its reliability. Animals one's grandparents had hunted no longer appearing where they had been. Plants flowering in the wrong season, or not flowering at all. Ice returning to lands that had begun to forget it. The stars wheeling above a sky that no longer indicated quite what it used to indicate. It is striking that the Younger Dryas brackets, almost exactly the period in which the foundations of so many later cultural traditions appear to have been laid. The earliest constructions at Göbekli Tepe rise into view in the centuries surrounding its end. The first hesitant cultivation of cereals in the Near East takes place in the same long interval. The earliest village experiments, Muribet, Jericho's older layers, Abu Huraira, pulse through this troubled climatic phase. It is a temptation, perhaps an irresistible one, to imagine that the very disturbances of the Younger Dryas were among the pressures that pushed human communities towards more settled, more organized, more symbolically intense modes of living. When the world stops behaving as expected, holding on to ritual, planting what one can, building anchored places to gather, all begin to make a new kind of sense. Sedentism would then not be a leisured invention of plenty, but partly a defensive crouch against a climate one could no longer trust. If something close to this is true, then the cultures emerging on the far side of the Younger Dryas were not pristine first inventors of civilization. They were heirs of older ways of life that had been damaged by the long instability, heirs of communities that had perhaps lost members, knowledge, perhaps entire villages, perhaps entire stretches of coastline. The new beginning was a beginning in name only. Beneath it lay the residue of what had not made it through. The carved boars and watching pillars of Göbekli Tepe in this reading are not the first stirrings of a young species. They are the careful labour of a population that had recently passed through severe trouble and was reaching for stone as a way of binding itself to something, a god, an ancestor, a calendar, that the moving earth could not so easily take away. What this leaves with the listener is not a tidy moral, but an unease that is more durable. The deep human past, in this view, includes at least one well-attested period in which the climate behaved like an unsteady hand, and possibly an interval in which a piece of the sky itself fell among the trees. Whether the second is true, or only the first, the consequence for our story is the same. The human entered the present epoch not from a long, undisturbed climb, but through a narrow, unpleasant gate. What came through that gate carried its earlier inheritance only partially. What was left on the other side of it, drowned, burned, frozen, simply unwitnessed, has been quietly absent from the official memory of the species ever since. What carried itself through that narrow gate did not always travel in the form of objects. Bones can survive a flood, stones can survive a fire. But a piece of knowledge, once it has passed out of every living mouth, is not preserved by sediment or chance. It must be carried in each generation by someone who remembers and someone who listens. The most fragile inheritance of the human past was never the pottery or the flint. It was the pattern of how to look at the world. And among the oldest patterns of looking, none seems to have rooted itself more deeply than the patient observation of the sky. The sky was, for almost the entire span of the human past, the most reliable thing the human eye could find. Coastlines moved, rivers shifted their beds, forests advanced and retreated with the centuries. Game appeared in the spring or did not. Even the seasons themselves, as the younger Dryas demonstrated, could turn against expectation. But the procession of the stars across the night, the regular rising and setting of the sun, the steady waxing and waning of the moon, kept their appointments. Whoever could read those appointments held a tool more durable than any made of bone or stone. They held a clock that no flood could drown and no fire could burn. They held the only large-scale rhythm in the universe that did not betray. The earliest evidence of careful sky-watching predates writing by such a wide margin that it can no longer be read directly. It can only be inferred. Yet the inferences accumulate. Bone plaques from Upper Paleolithic Europe, tens of thousands of years old, carry sequences of carved notches whose grouping and spacing have led some researchers to interpret them as lunar tallies. Month counts, possibly, or attempts to track menstrual or animal cycles against the moon. The Ornithian eagle-bone fragment from the Abri Blanchard, with its serpentine sequence of marks, is one of the most discussed of these. Some specialists insist it is a calendar of sorts. Others insist it is decoration. Neither side can entirely settle the question. What can be said is that very early, hands were marking patterns whose pattern resembled the moon's, and once that habit had taken root, it would not have been easily lost. The well-known passage at Lascaux in southwestern France, painted some 17,000 years ago, includes among its bulls and horses a small cluster of dots beside the head of one of the largest aurochs, a cluster that several researchers have noted matches the pattern of the Pleiades star cluster as it would have been seen at that latitude at that time. Other configurations within the cave have been compared more controversially to other constellations. None of these readings can be proven. All of them invite the suspicion that the painters of Lascaux did not see only the animals on their walls, but the heavens above them, and that the two were not in their minds separate. The hunt was the hunt of the year was the year of the sky. The animal moved across the rock as the constellation moved across the night. and the painter, in tracing both, was practicing a discipline whose later forms would one day be called astronomy. By the time monumental architecture begins to appear, the sky has clearly been watched for a very long time. Göbekli Tepe's central pillars seem to align with cardinal directions and possibly with significant rising points along the horizon. Stonehenge, raised on the chalk plain of southern Britain across many centuries beginning roughly 5,000 years ago, frames the rising of the midsummer sun and the setting of the midwinter sun within its great trilithons. The Newgrange Passage tomb in Ireland, older than Stonehenge by several centuries, admits a thin shaft of light into its central chamber only at sunrise on the days closest to the winter solstice, illuminating a back wall whose engravings have waited 5,000 years for that single annual visit. From the ancient mounds of the eastern Mississippi to the stone circles of Senegambia, from the temple platforms of pre-Inca Peru to the chambered cairns of the Orkney Islands, the same impulse repeats itself with sober persistence. Build something heavy. Tie it to the sun, the moon, or the stars. Anchor the community to the one rhythm the world cannot be cheated out of. This was not science in the modern sense. The line between observation and meaning had not yet been drawn. The midwinter sun reaching the back of a chamber was simultaneously a return of light, a return of a god, a promise of survival, a fulfillment of an ancestral covenant, and a piece of useful information about when to begin certain ceremonies and certain plantings. It was all of these things at once, because for the people who built such places, the world had not yet been broken into the separate compartments that later thought would invent. The stars were not merely lamps, they were beings, ancestors, signals, calendars, fates. The same eye that watched them ate, prayed, hunted, mourned, and slept under their light, and the watching was woven through every other action. Within such a way of life, knowledge was not stored in books. It was stored in songs, in dances, in initiation rites passed from elder to apprentice over decades, in the shape of a building, in the orientation of a doorway, in the sequence in which a fire was tended on certain nights of the year. Among many surviving indigenous traditions, the songline still functions as a vast oral atlas, in which entire stretches of land are remembered through the sequential singing of names, places, and acts of ancestral beings. The song is the map, the dance is the calendar, the pattern of the eldest ceremony is, in some real sense, the structure of the cosmos as that community has come to know it. To break such a chain of transmission is not to lose a single fact. It is to lose a continent of facts, all of which were held together by the act of the chain itself. This kind of knowledge does not survive disasters well. It does not need to be deliberately destroyed. It only needs to lose enough of its carriers within a few generations. A flood that drowns the elders, a famine that scatters the young, a migration that cuts the apprentices off from the masters, a new religion that forbids the old songs, a foreign empire that kills the ones who remember the names. Any of these can sever the line, and once severed, lines of this depth do not splice themselves back together. The instruments left behind, the stone circles, the aligned passages, the carved bones, are then read by later eyes that no longer know the songs they once accompanied. The eyes describe the stones honestly. They cannot describe the music that has gone silent above them. It may be that what most distinguishes the human inheritance now from the human inheritance of long ago is precisely the proportion of this kind of living knowledge that has been lost. The deep past was richer in such interior patterns, not because its inhabitants were more clever, but because they had not yet had whole epochs of disruption stripping their songs away. What remains in the surviving stones is the residue, the calcified outer shape of inner traditions far more elaborate than the shapes themselves can show. The astronomy of the deep past was not a primitive forerunner of the present. It was a different kind of knowing, more bodily, more communal, more bound to landscape and far more vulnerable. And the more one notices its quiet sophistication, the more one begins to suspect that what has reached us is something like the bones of a body whose breath, voice, and memory have long since left the room. Bones can outlast the breath that once moved them, so sometimes can the marks that breath made on stone, on bark, on bone itself. When entire languages have died, when entire peoples have dispersed, certain shapes still keep returning, drawn by hands that may no longer remember why their hands know how to draw them. The spiral, the serpent, the world tree, the cosmic axis, the great mother with widened hips, the horned animal, the eye in the centre of a sun. These figures appear, in slightly different dialects, on cave walls in France and on rock shelters in Australia, on Neolithic pottery in Anatolia, and on Amazonian textiles, on the carved jade of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, and on the painted ceilings of Egyptian tombs. Their persistence is so widespread that scholars have argued for over a century about what to make of it. The arguments have not produced a single agreed answer. They have, however, produced a quiet refusal of the simplest dismissals. The simplest dismissal is that nothing is being preserved across distances at all. Human minds, the argument runs, share certain structural features. They live under similar skies, watch similar sunrises, fear similar predators, give birth in similar pain. The brain, exposed to certain shapes, the spiralling water of a vortex, the curling smoke of a fire, the coiling motion of a snake, will tend to abstract those shapes into similar marks. Convergence in this account is sufficient. Independent invention everywhere. No need to invoke ancient transmissions, no need to suspect lost lines of contact. This argument is real. It cannot be ignored. Many similarities across cultures are surely the result of common bodies meeting common world. The mistake would be to assume that this exhausts the matter, because some patterns are not merely shared shapes, they are shared clusters of shape and meaning. The serpent is associated, in tradition after tradition, with water, with the underworld, with hidden knowledge, with healing, with regenerating skin. The world tree appears again and again as an axis joining the underworld, the middle world, and the heavens, its branches receiving the souls of birds and the divine winds. The cosmic mountain stands at the centre of an ordered cosmos, the place where earth touches sky, the four directions, the four winds, the four colours, the four animals, variations on a fourfold geometry, turn up across continents, sometimes shadowed by an emergent fifth which is the centre, the self, the axis. The labyrinth winds inward in cultures that never met one another. The widespread association of the cardinal east with rebirth, of the west with death, of the celestial above with order, and of the chthonic below with fertility and threat, repeats itself with a regularity that begins to overstrain the explanation by mere similarity of human nervous systems. It is not necessary to imagine a single lost civilization broadcasting its symbols outward to all the others. That picture, popular in certain speculative literatures, demands more than the evidence will bear. It is enough to consider that human beings have been moving across the planet for far longer than the conventional history of culture acknowledges, and that the long, slow networks of contact between communities, through trade, through migration, through marriage, through the simple meeting of neighbours at a borderline, could have transmitted certain core ideas across enormous distances over enormous spans of time, without any single sender ever being identifiable. A symbol is a small thing to carry. It can travel in a song, in a tattoo, in a child's first lesson, in the shape of a pendant worn around a neck. By the time the receiving culture absorbs it, the source is forgotten. The shape, however, remains. There are, in addition, certain symbol patterns whose persistence is hard to attribute either to convergence or to slow drift, because they appear too elaborately specific. The image of the world serpent encircling the earth, biting its own tail, recurs in Norse mythology as Jormungandr, in Egyptian iconography as the Mehen and the Ouroboros, in Greek alchemical and Gnostic traditions, in Mesoamerican glyphs of feathered serpents whose bodies coil around heaven and earth. The image of the divine twins, often associated with a horse and the morning and evening stars, surfaces in Vedic India, in Greek myth, in Baltic folklore, in some indigenous American traditions. The flood survivor with his ark of seeds, met already in the previous reflections, is itself a near universal symbol cluster of this kind. Whether one attributes such convergences to a deep common stratum of human storytelling, or to long untraceable threads of contact and influence, the practical effect for the listener is similar. There is a layer of human meaning that is older and more widely shared than the surface differences of culture suggest. Whatever its origin, that layer behaves as if it has been around for a very long time. Some of the most disquieting echoes of this symbolic substratum are not in pictures but in geometry. The use of the circle as the figure of completion, of the square as the figure of stability and earth, of the triangle as the figure of ascent or sacred power, of the equal-armed cross as the figure of orientation and order, of the spiral as the figure of process and return, runs through artifact after artifact across millennia. Sacred enclosures arranged on these geometries, circular henges, square ceremonial precincts, octagonal mandalas, cruciform churches that themselves inherit the cross plan from older sacred architectures, speak the same vocabulary in stone and ground that beads and bone carving spoke earlier in miniature. It is as though the human, when wishing to mark something as truly important, instinctively reached again and again for the same small set of shapes. And this set of shapes was not arbitrary, it was, in some way, given. Where this givenness comes from is the deep question. Some have proposed that certain figures arise spontaneously in altered states of consciousness, in dreaming, in fasting, in trance, in the half-light between sleep and wakefulness, and that humans across the world, encountering them in those states, brought them out and inscribed them on the rock face, on the body, on the pot. There is laboratory research suggesting that certain so-called entoptic patterns, grids, lattices, spirals, zigzags, recur in human visual experience under various conditions. Some of these are remarkably similar to the geometric patterns that appear on the oldest decorated objects. If this line of thought is correct, then a portion of the global symbolic vocabulary is rooted not in any specific historical transmission, but in the structure of the human nervous system itself. Yet even this leaves the more elaborate cluster images, the world's serpent, the cosmic tree, the divine twins, outside the simple neurological explanation. Those seem too narratively complete to come straight from the optic cortex. They look more like distilled stories. What survives, then, in this submerged language of symbols, may be the most ancient, least explicit, least centrally organized inheritance of all. Not a body of teachings preserved by an institution, not a code carved on a stele, but a long half-forgotten common dialect of meaning carried by people whose names are gone, whose faces never sat for any portrait, whose tongue spoke languages no living person can pronounce. Their gift to the present is a set of shapes and a set of associations that keep arriving in our art, our churches, our flags, our dreams, often without our knowing where they came from. The fact that they keep arriving and that they keep being recognized suggests that the conversation between humanity and itself is far older than the histories now in print. Somewhere, very far back, the conversation began. It has been continuing under the surface ever since, even when the surface believed itself to be speaking for the first time. The conversation thus survives in symbols is older than any one of those who continued it. The bodies that spoke it, however briefly, are mostly gone, yet bodies are not as silent as their disappearance would suggest. There is a kind of evidence that does not require a stone to have been carved or a story to have been remembered. It is written in the calcium of a tooth, in the spiral of a chromosome, in the small wear marks where one bone has rubbed against another over decades. The body is, in this sense, an honest archive. Perhaps the only fully honest one available, because the body cannot lie about what it has eaten, where it has walked, with whom it has slept, or what diseases have moved through its blood. The body remembers without being asked. This kind of remembering has expanded astonishingly within the last few decades. Stable isotope analysis can now distinguish, in human teeth and bones, the geological signatures of the water people drank and the foods they ate. The strontium absorbed in childhood from the local soil locks itself into the enamel of the molars and stays there. The oxygen ratios in cooking water and drinking sources persist in the same enamel. By comparing the isotope ratios in a person's teeth, formed in childhood, with those in their bones, which renew over the last decades of life, one can sometimes determine whether they grew up in one valley and died in another, whether they moved once or many times, whether the person buried at a Bronze Age site in Central Europe was born nearby or carried there from far away. Long after a name is lost, the chemistry of the skeleton can testify that this individual walked great distances, or did not, that this child was nursed on milk from animals whose own water came from a country half a continent away, that this woman, dying in middle age in one community, had been born among a quite different people somewhere else. When such methods are applied broadly to ancient cemeteries, the picture that emerges is almost always more mobile than the local memory of any one place would suggest. Communities that earlier reconstructions imagined as essentially static, generations rooted to one valley, turn out to have been crossed regularly by incomers, wives, husbands, children, perhaps captives, perhaps refugees, perhaps long-distance traders. People at the same hearth often come from different soils. The genetic record, when it can be recovered from ancient bone, frequently confirms and deepens this. The Neolithic spread of farming into Europe is now known to have involved, among other things, a real movement of people from Anatolia, mingling with and partly replacing earlier hunter-gatherer populations, who themselves had earlier histories of migration and admixture not fully visible in the artifacts they left behind. Later still, the Bronze Age saw the sweeping arrival of populations whose ancestry traces back to the steppes north of the Black Sea, bringing with them new burial customs, new kinds of metalwork, and very probably the early forms of the Indo-European languages that now dominate so many continents. None of this, until recently, was readable in the pottery alone. The bodies, however, have been keeping the receipts the whole time. This new visibility is humbling for almost every traditional account of who the present descends from. Modern populations rarely turn out to be the simple continuation of any single ancient population. They are, almost without exception, the result of overlapping waves of arrival, of complex layered ancestries, of contributions from peoples now invisible above ground. Even within regions that later mythology described as the immemorial homeland of a single race, the genomic record reveals histories of migration, replacement, partial blending, and survival of older lineages in pockets within the new. The cherished image of a particular country as belonging to a particular long-rooted lineage, often used by later nationalisms to justify everything from cultural pride to violence, sits very uneasily with what bones and chromosomes have begun to tell. The bodies do not respect the boundaries of later identities. They walked, they mingled, they crossed rivers their later descendants believed they had always lived behind. Beneath this large-scale picture of movement lies the more intimate testimony of the individual skeleton. Skeletons remember malnutrition. They remember violence. A child who suffered a severe illness or famine at the age of 3 may carry the evidence of that crisis in faint horizontal grooves across the enamel of their adult teeth, sometimes called Harris lines or enamel hypoplasia. A man whose life was spent drawing a bow has different muscle attachments on his arms than one who spent his life paddling a canoe. A woman who bore many children has subtle changes on her pelvis that an experienced eye can read. Old fractures that healed badly, swollen bone surfaces that bear witness to long-running infections, decapitation cuts on neck vertebrae, arrowheads embedded in ribs, blunt force depressions on skulls. Each of these is a fragment of a biography that may otherwise have left no name. The mute condition of these biographies is itself a kind of indictment of the polished narratives at the official surface of history. The kings are remembered, the queens are remembered, the generals and priests are remembered. The vast majority of those whose labour and suffering actually composed the body of the past are remembered, when remembered at all, only by their bones. Disease, too, is part of the body's archive. Ancient genomes recovered from teeth and bones have begun to allow reconstruction of the pathogens that moved through past populations. Variants of the bacterium responsible for plague have been recovered from skeletons many thousands of years old, well before the well-documented pandemics of the medieval era, hinting that the same disease has shadowed human communities for far longer than the surviving written records describe. Tuberculosis, leprosy, smallpox, treponemal diseases all leave traces in the body, sometimes in the genome of the pathogen itself, sometimes in the deformations of the host's bones. The history of human suffering is therefore not only what was written by chroniclers, it is what is encoded in the molecular ruins of those infections that may have shaped where people could settle, with whom they could safely associate, what their gods asked of them, and how their populations rose or fell across the centuries. The accumulated effect of all this evidence is to relocate the deepest record of human existence away from the surface of culture and into the interior of the body. Books can burn, temples can be torn down, languages can be silenced, whole peoples can be expelled from official memory. But genes, isotopes, and the architecture of bones do not care which empire is currently in power. They store what happened to the body that bore them, and they go on storing it for thousands of years after the last witness has died. In this sense, the modern human carries within himself a chronicle that the empires of the past would not always have wanted preserved. The mixing they denied, the mobility they tried to forget, the diseases they hid, the violence they explained away, all of it sits, often unread, in the chemistry of the living and in the dust of the long buried, waiting for those willing to ask the body the questions the official documents were never going to answer. The body remembers in private, the land remembers in public. Where the body keeps its records in chemistry and bone, the landscape keeps its records in layers, in alignments, in the persistent reuse of the same hills and the same springs by generation after generation, each leaving its faint impression on the place before passing on. A skilled eye, walking through certain regions of the world, can almost see the layers in the way a place is shaped, the older terrace under the newer wall, the curve of an early field still visible beneath a modern road, the alignment of a Christian church oriented along an axis that was once a pagan procession. The land beneath such places functions as a palimpsest, a document that has been written upon, scraped and written upon again, never fully erased, never wholly legible. The earliest layer of this writing is so old that its conventions are almost lost to interpretation. There are caves whose use stretches back into the Paleolithic, in which floors carry the residue of fires kept for tens of thousands of years, with the painted images of one era deepening into the engraved images of another. And over those, in some cases, the offerings of much later peoples who came as strangers but recognized that the place was, in some way, sacred. The cave of Nio in the French Pyrenees, the chambers at Altamira in northern Spain, the deep galleries of Chauvet. These are not single sites with single histories. They are accumulations. People entered them, built fires, painted, scratched and prayed, then left them silent for thousands of years, then entered them again. The painters of Chauvet themselves, working some 30,000 years ago, may already have been responding to traces left by those before them. There is no clean first day in such places. The first day, if it ever existed, lies under so many later days that it cannot be approached. This pattern repeats itself, in slightly altered form, at almost every monumental site that has ever been carefully excavated. The temples of Karnak in Egypt are not a single building. They're a thicket of interlocking constructions across more than 2,000 years, in which each pharaoh added, modified, or partially demolished the work of his predecessors, often using stones from earlier monuments to build later ones. The Acropolis of Athens carries a Mycenaean foundation beneath its classical Greek temples, themselves modified again under Roman rule, again under Byzantine Christianity, again under Ottoman conversion to military use, again under modern restoration. The mound of Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, the site claimed for ancient Troy, has yielded at least 9 major successive cities, layered one above the other across more than 3 millennia. To dig at such places is not to descend through a sequence of unrelated lives. It is to read a single immensely thick book, in which each generation has scribbled its annotations on the margins of those who came before, often without troubling to read them first. The pattern is perhaps most poignant where holy ground has changed religions. Across much of the Mediterranean and the Near East, churches stand on the foundations of older temples. In Rome, the Basilica of San Clemente preserves, beneath its present medieval floor, an earlier basilica of the 4th century, beneath which lies a Mithraic temple still earlier, beneath which lies a 1st century Roman building, beneath which lies an even older Republican-era structure, a single shaft of architecture that descends through nearly 2,000 years of changing devotion in the same square of urban ground. In southern Mexico, Catholic shrines were raised on the platforms of dismantled pre-Columbian temples deliberately to assert the supremacy of the new faith over the old. In northern Europe, churches and chapels often stand at sites long associated with springs, sacred groves, or pagan stones. The older stones, sometimes broken up and built into the new walls, sometimes spared and standing nearby in awkward dialogue with the cross. The visible religion claims the place, but the place itself is older than the visible religion, and was already claimed when it was claimed again. There is a particular kind of orientation that sometimes betrays the depth of these layers. Many medieval European churches are aligned approximately east-west, with the altar in the east, so that the rising sun touches the Holy of Holies first. This Christian convention, however, did not arise out of nothing. It inherited a much older association of the rising sun with rebirth and divinity that extends back through Roman, Greek, Egyptian, and pre-Egyptian traditions. The orientation of certain great prehistoric tombs in Western Europe, Newgrange, Mashoa, the long barrows of the British Downlands, was already aligned to solar events thousands of years before any of the religions that today claim those landscapes were imagined. When a Romanesque chapel rose in the 11th century on top of a Bronze Age tumulus, it was, without realizing it, paying tribute to a calendar that had been observed at the same point on Earth for far longer than its own theology had existed. The newer faith took over the inherited shape of the place and called the inheritance its own. This long succession at the same point of ground reveals something that pure chronology cannot. It reveals that places possess a gravity that exceeds any one of the cultures that has used them. A spring is a spring. A pass through the mountains is a pass. A confluence of rivers, a hilltop with a wide view, an island in a marsh, a cave whose echo answers the human voice. These are anchors of attention that successive cultures recognize as significant, even when they no longer share any of the beliefs of their predecessors. The Christian builds his chapel where the Roman built his shrine, where the Celt built his sanctuary, where the Bronze Age farmer left his offering, where the Mesolithic hunter performed some ceremony whose nature we do not now know. Each time, the new visitor feels the rightness of the place, often without being able to say why. The rightness is, in part, the residue of all the previous attentions, soaked into the place by their long repetition. What this suggests, when one steps back, is a relationship between human and land much harder to fit into the standard linear story than the surface narrative pretends. The story of a particular religion claiming a particular sacred site at a particular date does not begin to capture the depth of accumulation involved. The site was usually sacred long before. The new faith took it over, retold its meaning, suppressed or absorbed its older cults, and often forgot within a few centuries that any earlier meaning had ever attached to the place. The site, however, did not forget. It carries in the specifics of its layout, in the orientation of its principal structures, in the small odd persistences of its local folklore, the half-buried memories of the older claimants. Many of those memories now require excavation to reach. Some require only careful walking and listening to local stories. Some, suspended in symbols and rituals that survived inside the new religion, hide in plain sight. To stand on such ground and acknowledge what lies beneath one's feet is to feel the ordinary picture of history grow translucent. The latest layer is often the only one that the present knows by name. The deeper layers are spoken of, when at all, in the hushed register of legend or the dry register of archaeology. Yet they are no less real for being silent. Beneath the floor on which the present generation stands, beneath the rituals it performs as though for the first time, lie the rituals of those who came before. And further beneath them, the rituals of those whom even the previous knew only as ancestors, half mythical, half forgotten. The land remembers what the speech has lost, and it does so without complaint, simply by holding the layers in place and waiting for someone with patience and a small enough trowel to read them. The land remembers what the speech has lost, but speech, when it does survive, is rarely innocent. The instant a memory leaves the silent ground and enters the human mouth, it begins to be shaped, edited, hardened into something usable. By the time it reaches the page, it has usually been worked upon by many hands, none of which had any obligation to preserve it as it first arrived. Among the most consequential silent forces in the history of the human past has not been the loss of evidence to fire and flood. It has been the long, patient labour of those who decided which version of the past would be permitted to be remembered, and which would not. This labour begins quietly with the first specialists of memory. Long before the rise of any particular institution, there were those whose function in their communities was to know the songs, the genealogies, the seasonal rites, the names of places, the stories of the ancestors. Bardic and priestly figures of this kind have been documented across many cultures, from the Druids of pre-Roman Gaul to the Fili of early Ireland, from the Kahuna of Polynesia to the diviners of West Africa, from the Brahmins of early India to the temple scribes of ancient Sumer and Egypt. Their authority depended on their command of an inheritance that, ordinary members of the community did not and could not fully share. Such command brought with it real power. The keeper of the past was also, inevitably, the gatekeeper of which past would be told. To remember selectively is in practice to forget on behalf of others. When writing arrived, the gates grew taller. The earliest writing systems we know, cuneiform, hieroglyphic, the Indus script which still resists confident decipherment, the early Chinese oracle bones, were not popular technologies. They were instruments of administration and ritual, controlled by small literate elites attached to temples and palaces. The texts that survive from these early periods are overwhelmingly the kinds of texts such institutions found worth preserving. Hymns to the gods of the dynasty, lists of offerings and tributes, royal annals celebrating the king's victories, ritual prescriptions, occasional legal codes. The texts they did not produce or did not preserve included most of the stories told by farmers in their fields, by mothers to their children at night, by men around the fire on a hunt, by old women remembering the world they had been born into. That stratum of speech is largely lost. What remains is the official surface, polished by those whose interest was in maintaining the order they served. The polishing has its own characteristic effects. Earlier traditions are often absorbed into later official accounts in ways that flatten their dissonance. A god of an older population becomes a minor figure in the pantheon of the newer rulers. A foreign creation story is partly merged with the local one, with the foreign elements carefully subordinated. A folk hero of a vanquished culture becomes a rebellious villain in the Chronicles of the Conquerors. A festival whose origin lies in a much older agricultural rite is reinterpreted as a commemoration of an event in the favoured mythic cycle of the dominant religion. The original is not destroyed outright. That would be too crude. It is annexed. Its energy is captured. Its independence is dissolved. The version that survives is the version the new order can tell about itself. This dynamic intensified dramatically with the rise of large-scale missionary and exclusivist religions. Earlier faiths had been comparatively comfortable with each other's gods. The Romans built temples to local deities in the territories they conquered, often identifying foreign gods with their own. The Greeks were quick to recognize their familiar pantheon under foreign names. Within such a framework, an older cult might be subordinated, but it was rarely systematically destroyed. The faiths that came later, claiming exclusive truth, behaved differently. The slow Christianization of the Roman world, beginning in earnest in the 4th century, saw the closing of pagan temples, the suppression of the mystery religions, the burning of magical and astrological texts, the transformation of older sanctuaries into churches, and the redefinition of older deities as demons in the newer cosmology. Similar dynamics played out, with different cultural flavours, in the spread of Islam across late antique landscapes, in the spread of Christianity into the New World after the 15th century, in the long suppression of native religious practices in colonial Africa and Asia. Vast bodies of knowledge were lost in these transitions. Some of it was burned outright. Some of it was disguised in folk customs that survived under the radar of official observance. Some of it was forgotten only because the children of the converted were no longer taught what their grandparents had known. The Library of Alexandria has become perhaps unfairly the iconic image of this kind of loss. Its actual fate was not a single dramatic burning by a single villain, but a slow attrition across centuries, through fires, civil wars, neglect, and the gradual replacement of its scrolls by the priorities of new regimes. Whatever its precise history, the symbol is appropriate to the larger phenomenon. Across antiquity and the early medieval world, libraries and archives were repeatedly damaged, neglected, deliberately purged, or simply allowed to decay because no powerful institution any longer had a use for them. The Maya codices of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica are a particularly stark example. a sophisticated manuscript culture, of which only a handful of books survive today, because most were burned by Spanish clerics who saw their contents as diabolical. What is now known of Mesoamerican astronomy, mathematics, and ritual is reconstructed from a few survivors and from the cautious testimony of those who learned what little they could before the holders of the older knowledge died. The bonfire in such cases is not merely a destruction, it is an editing of the human past performed at speed. Even outside such dramatic moments, the steady editing continues. Empires write the histories of the peoples they conquer. Victorious dynasties commission official annals that recast their predecessors as decadent or cruel. Religious reformers reinterpret the doctrines of their forerunners as confused approximations of the truth they themselves now possess. Modern nation-states draft history textbooks that subtly reshape the contributions of minorities, the violence of their founding, the depth of their continuity. None of this requires conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It only requires the ordinary working of institutions that prefer their own legitimacy to the inconveniences of the full record. Over generations, the cumulative effect of such preferences is enormous. The version of the past that arrives at any given present is always a version that has been useful enough to those in charge that it was not edited out. This means that even the most sober history available is not a transparent window onto what happened. It is a heavily curated reconstruction, in which the silences are at least as eloquent as the surviving voices, if one is willing to listen for them. The peoples whose libraries were burned do not speak in the official record. The traditions that were declared heretical do not appear under their own names. The rituals that were absorbed into newer religions appear in disguise, often unrecognized even by the worshippers who continue them. Behind every page that was preserved stands a vast, unwritten library of pages that were not. The size of the unwritten library cannot be calculated. It can only be intuited by the strange resonances and gaps in what does survive. And from this point onward, the question of human origins ceases to be merely a question of evidence. It becomes also a question of who has had the power, across all these centuries, to decide what evidence we're even allowed to consider. The unwritten library is not only a place of absence, it is also, in a strange way, the foundation upon which everything still being written stands. Those who pick up the pen in the present do not begin on blank paper. They begin on a surface already saturated with what has been edited away, and the shape of that absence guides their hand whether they notice it or not. Out of this peculiar condition arises a possibility that earlier centuries of thought rarely confronted directly, and that recent decades have begun to articulate with growing seriousness. The civilization that the present takes as the normal condition of human life may not be the first attempt of its kind. It may be the second, or the third, or the latest in a longer succession than the surviving record allows one to count. This thought is easily caricatured, and the caricature must be set aside before the more careful version can be examined. The caricature imagines a single global high civilization, technologically dazzling, perhaps in possession of arts and sciences greater than those of the present, suddenly destroyed in a moment of catastrophe and almost completely erased from the geological record. This picture has been a favourite of speculative literature for more than a century, and its persistence in popular imagination has done its share of harm to more measured discussion. Hard evidence for such a vanished super-civilization simply does not exist. The geological signatures one would expect, distinctive synthetic compounds in sediments, traces of large-scale industrial pollution, identifiable refined materials in soil layers from the late Pleistocene, are absent. The serious version of the question is more modest and more interesting. The serious version asks whether human communities in particular regions may have already developed considerable depth of organization, knowledge, and ritual sophistication well before the conventional thresholds of civilization, and whether the cataclysms and slow attritions of the late Ice Age and early Holocene may have damaged or scattered such communities so badly that what came after had to begin again from a lower platform than the one their forebears had reached. A civilizational restart in this sense would not require a lost technological empire. It would require only that some local trajectories of cultural complexity were broken at moments severe enough that their inheritors did not realize how much had been lost. The newcomers gathering up the fragments would naturally believe themselves to be at the beginning. They would have no way of knowing that they were standing on the remains of something else. Several lines of suggestion converge here. The drowned coasts already considered in earlier reflections likely held a disproportionate share of human settlement during the long glacial period, and their loss removed precisely those communities whose adaptations to the rich edges of land and water might have permitted unusually intense cultural development. The younger Dryas reversal disrupted whatever recovery had begun in the warming centuries before it. The wave of megafaunal extinctions that swept through the late Pleistocene removed the large prey on which entire hunting cultures had been organized for millennia, forcing whatever survived to retool its way of life. Through all of this, the surviving populations were small, scattered, and under pressure. The wonder is not that the resulting cultures appear in the archaeological record to be relatively modest in scale and slow in their early Neolithic recovery. The wonder is that anything continued at all. When something does continue, it often shows the marks of inherited skill rather than fresh discovery. The earliest farmers of the Near East did not approach the problem of plant cultivation as bewildered innovators. They behaved like people who already had a long, intimate knowledge of the wild grasses and pulses around them, which seeds ripened when, which yielded best, which could be stored, which could be planted to germinate. Generations of foragers, knowledge accumulated through the slow patience of women gathering had presumably preceded the moment when someone first decided to deliberately scatter and tend rather than only collect. Similarly, the first metallurgists did not stumble blindly into copper. The earliest copper artifacts, in places like Çatalhöyük and the Balkans, sit alongside long traditions of pyrotechnical skill in pottery, in plaster, in the precise control of hearth temperatures. The leap from clay to metal was a leap, but it was made from a high platform. Where this becomes especially suggestive is in those moments when a new culture appears in the visible record to arrive almost fully formed. The early dynastic period of Egypt, around 5,000 years ago, opens with monumental art, complex hieroglyphic writing, and elaborate state administration in a state of striking maturity, with relatively shallow archaeological roots in the immediately preceding centuries. The same pattern holds for early dynastic Sumer, where the cities of southern Mesopotamia emerge with full-blown religious and economic institutions whose precursors, while present, do not seem to fully account for the elaboration that suddenly appears. The Indus Valley cities, with their carefully planned grids, their standardized weights and measures, and their script that scholars still cannot decipher, surface in the third millennium with a polish that earlier village settlements only dimly anticipate. None of these examples requires the assumption of a vanished supercivilization. Each, however, sits more comfortably with the suggestion that the cultures producing them inherited intellectual and organizational traditions, whose deeper origins are not preserved in any visible chain of evidence. If even part of this is correct, then a peculiar humility is required of any account of present civilization. What now appears as the long story of progress, from the agricultural revolution through the rise of cities, the invention of writing, the emergence of philosophy, the development of science, may not be the simple ascending arc it presents itself to be. It may be a recovery, a patient multi-generational reconstitution of capacities, traditions, and institutions whose earlier versions were broken by the trials of the late Ice Age. The reconstitution would necessarily be partial. Things would have been lost forever. Other things would have to be reinvented from the beginning. Still others would persist as fragments without their original context. Old myths newly explained, old symbols repurposed, old technologies rediscovered without memory of their first invention. In such a picture, the present is not the consummation of a triumphant climb. It is one of several stages in a longer drama, none of which has yet had the privilege of being final. The civilizations that sit on top of the ruins of their predecessors usually believe themselves to be the first true civilization, just as the Egyptians regarded their golden age as the original order of things, just as the Romans regarded their empire as the natural shape of the world, just as later European powers regarded their own arrangements as the inevitable culmination of human development. Each in its turn was wrong in the same fundamental way. Each was a recovery from earlier loss, mistaking itself for an unprecedented beginning. If this is true, the present's own confidence in itself becomes unsettling. The current global civilization is more complex, more interconnected, and more dependent on fragile networks of supply and information than any of its known predecessors. It also faces, in the climate destabilization of its own making, the kind of large-scale environmental disruption that earlier turnings of the wheel suggest can shatter cultural orders quite swiftly. To imagine that this latest civilization is uniquely exempt from the conditions that broke earlier ones is, on the face of it, simply a continuation of the recurring delusion. To consider that the human story may yet again pass through a narrow gate, with most of what is held precious lost on the other side, is not pessimism. It is only the application to one's own time of the same patience one applies, in retrospect, to the lost coasts and the silent sanctuaries of those who came before. The wheel does not stop turning because the present believes itself to be the rim. The wheel does not stop turning, and yet the mind, once it has begun to suspect that the wheel exists at all, finds itself drawn back again and again to the small inconsistencies that first hinted at its presence. The objects, the sites, the dates, the readings of bones and pollen and isotopes that refuse to fall neatly into the agreed sequence. The handful of finds that, even after every reasonable correction has been applied, still seem to whisper that something in the picture is not quite right. They're easy to overstate. They're also easy to dismiss. The honest position, harder to occupy than either, is to take them seriously without converting them into the dramatic certainties their loudest interpreters often want to extract. Among the most discussed of these strange residues are certain enigmatic monuments whose dating remains contested, whose function remains debated, and whose place in the standard chronology has been adjusted more than once in living memory. The vast carved blocks at the base of the Sphinx in Egypt, with the patterns of erosion some geologists have argued are characteristic of prolonged rainfall in a region now arid for thousands of years. The submerged stepped structures off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, whose status as natural formation or human construction continues to divide opinion. The puzzling tunnels at Ravne under the so-called Bosnian Pyramid Hill, whose interpretation oscillates between the geological and the archaeological, depending on which specialist is consulted. The strange megalithic platform of Gunung Padang in Indonesia, where recent investigations have suggested layers far older than orthodox chronologies expected, and where the controversy over these datings is still unresolved. None of these constitutes proof of a lost civilization. Each constitutes a small, persistent itch that will not be quite scratched away by the present arrangement of knowledge. Beyond such celebrated cases lie quieter anomalies that rarely reach the popular imagination. Stone tools of unexpected antiquity in regions where humans, by the standard model, are not supposed to have arrived so early. Genetic signals in modern populations that hint at contributions from groups not yet identified in the bone record, or astronomical alignments at certain ancient sites whose precision exceeds what their builders' presumed level of knowledge would allow. Linguistic similarities between supposedly unrelated languages on opposite sides of vast oceans. Recurring images on pottery and textiles in cultures separated by distances and centuries that ought to have prevented their contact. Each such anomaly, taken alone, can usually be explained or set aside. Taken together, they form a slow drumbeat of doubt against the smoother surfaces of the standard story. They suggest, without quite proving, that the standard story has been kept tidy partly by ignoring its untidiest correspondence. What does one do with such material as a thinking creature, neither willing to be carried away by sensational reconstructions, nor willing to flatten genuine puzzles into noise? Perhaps the most useful posture is the one practiced, often unintentionally, by the best of the historical sciences themselves. Hold the picture lightly. Acknowledge that it is a working approximation built from what has happened to survive, by methods that have themselves evolved, in cultural conditions that have shaped which questions could even be asked. Be willing to revise the picture when sufficient new evidence arrives. Resist the temptation to confuse the current state of knowledge with the final shape of the truth. And do not mistake the silence of the absent for confirmation that they were never there. This posture has consequences for how the present regards itself. If the human past is, in the end, a story of repeated loss only partially compensated for by repeated recovery, then the present civilization is not a final achievement standing serenely above all that came before. It is a moment like other moments before it, in which an enormous amount has been preserved at the cost of an enormous amount that has been forgotten. It carries, in its art and architecture and law and language, the inherited residue of older cultures it can no longer fully name. It also carries, in the gaps of its own self-knowledge, the certainty that there are kinds of human experience and human capacity that earlier generations developed and the present has lost, just as there are kinds the present has developed that earlier generations could not have imagined. The arc is not straight. It bends, breaks, doubles back, recovers in unexpected places, and continues into a future about which the most honest present statement is that it cannot be foreseen. The deepest provocation in all of this is not the suggestion that the human past was longer or stranger than has been told, though it almost certainly was. It is the suggestion that the human present, with all its certainties about itself, sits within a larger pattern it does not control and only dimly understands. The civilizations of the Bronze Age believed themselves to be the natural order of things. The civilizations of the Iron Age thought the same. The classical world thought it of itself. The medieval world thought it. Each major modern epoch has thought it. Each has been wrong in the same way, by mistaking its own arrangements for the conclusion of the human story, rather than for one more episode within it. There is no obvious reason to assume that the present, of all moments, is the first one in which this mistake has finally been outgrown. What the long, half-readable record of the human past offers, then, is not so much a definite answer to the question of where the human came from. It offers a discipline of attention, a willingness to see one's own moment as part of a much longer drama, a capacity to listen with a quieter pride to the voices that survived the various silencings, through stone, through bone, through symbol, through song, and to acknowledge that for every voice that survived, others did not, and that the silence around the surviving voices is not empty but populated by those whose contributions to what we are can no longer be specifically named. The acknowledgement costs nothing and changes much. It loosens the hold of the present's confidence in its own uniqueness. It opens the heart just a little to the possibility that the species has been deeper, older, more wounded, and more enduring than the official story has had time to admit. In the soft hours when sleep is finally close, when the ordinary boundaries of self begin to loosen, such an acknowledgement can be received without resistance. The body knows, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that it is the latest carrier of an immensely long inheritance. The bones know they were grown from the calcium of older ground. The voice knows it learned to speak from those who learned from those who learned from a mouth whose first sound is unrecoverable. None of this is alarming when received in the right spirit. It is, in a strange way, comforting. The self briefly ceases to be an isolated point. It becomes a thread in something far older and far longer, a thread that did not begin with this life and will not end with it, a thread that has passed through fires and floods, through silences and songs, through the rise and fall of civilizations whose names are gone and whose arrangements are forgotten, and that still, somehow tonight, beats quietly within the chest of whoever is listening. The fog, in the end, does not lift. It only grows familiar enough to walk through, and in the walking the human comes upon shapes that he half remembers, voices he half hears, paths that have been walked before, by feet that were once warmer than his own and are now indistinguishable from the soil. Whether everything we thought we knew about our origins is wrong, or only partly wrong, or wrong in ways too subtle to put into words, may not be the most important question after all. The more important question may simply be whether the present generation has the patience to keep listening in the long quiet for what its predecessors were trying all along to say.